Picture a world where the ground could split open without warning, where rivers swelled into monstrous tides overnight, and where the only warning of disaster was the raw instinct of those who lived through it. This was the medieval world, a time without weather forecasts, emergency alerts, or modern medicine, where survival hinged on sheer human courage and the ability to think fast in the face of unimaginable chaos. Today, we're diving into 28 astonishing acts of bravery that defied the odds during some of history's most devastating natural disasters. These aren't just stories of survival. They're testaments to the unyielding spirit of ordinary people who became heroes when the world around them crumbled. Think about the last time you heard a storm warning or felt the rumble of an earthquake drill. Now strip away every modern convenience. No sirens, no shelters, no disaster relief teams rushing in. That's the reality medieval communities faced. Yet, against all odds, individuals rose to the occasion with nothing but quick thinking and unwavering resolve. From monks who turned their monasteries into flood shelters to blacksmiths who forged tools to dig survivors from collapsed buildings, these tales are etched in the cracks of history, waiting to be rediscovered. What made these acts of courage possible, and what can we learn from them today, in a world where technology often shields us from the raw power of nature? This isn't just a journey into the past, it's a mirror held up to our own resilience. As we uncover these forgotten stories, you'll meet villagers who formed human chains to rescue neighbors from rising waters, knights who abandoned their swords to carry the injured to safety, and healers who used herbs and hope to mend the broken. Their actions weren't just about survival, they were about humanity at its brightest in the darkest hours. So let's step into their world, where every decision meant life or death, and where the echoes of their bravery still whisper lessons for us today. By the end, you won't just remember their names, you'll feel the weight of their choices and the timeless power of courage in the face of the unknown. Imagine living in a world where the sky could turn from calm to catastrophic in moments, where the earth itself seemed to have a will of its own. Medieval Europe faced this reality daily, a place where nature's wrath was as unpredictable as it was merciless. Without satellites tracking storms or seismographs detecting tremors, communities were left to interpret the signs as best they could. Some turned to the patterns of animals, the color of the sunset, or the whispers of elders passed down through generations. Others clung to faith, praying for divine intervention when the winds howled or the ground shook. But one thing united them all, the understanding that survival wasn't guaranteed. It was earned through quick thinking, resourcefulness, and above all, courage. Take the Great Flood of 1180, when the Rhine River swelled beyond recognition, swallowing entire villages in its path. With no government aid or disaster protocols, it fell to ordinary people to act. Farmers used their knowledge of the land to guide others to higher ground, while carpenters lashed together rafts from whatever wood they could salvage. Even children pitched in, carrying supplies or tending to the injured. These weren't just acts of desperation. They were displays of a community's collective strength, forged in the absence of modern safeguards. Or consider the earthquakes that struck Italy in the 1300s, toppling towers and burying streets under rubble. In the chaos, it wasn't kings or armies who saved lives, it was neighbors. Blacksmiths used their tools to pry stones from collapsed buildings, while midwives turned their knowledge of herbs into makeshift pain relievers for the trapped and wounded. Every decision was a gamble, every action a potential lifeline. What's striking isn't just that they survived, but how they did it, with ingenuity honed by necessity and a refusal to surrender to despair. This backdrop of constant vulnerability makes their bravery even more extraordinary. Today, we might see a storm coming days in advance or rebuild with reinforced materials, but medieval lives hung in the balance of instinct and improvisation. Yet within that fragility lay a resilience we still recognize, the unshakable belief that even in the darkest hours, humanity can rise. As we uncover these 28 acts of courage, remember, they weren't just fighting nature. They were proving what people are capable of when everything else falls away. The night was black as pitch when Brother Aldrich first heard the distant roar, a sound like thunder, but deeper, more relentless. It was the year 1154, and the River Severn had burst its banks after weeks of unrelenting rain. Most of the monastery's brothers slept soundly, unaware that a wall of water was rushing toward them. But Aldrich, a man who'd spent decades studying the land's subtle warnings, knew what the eerie stillness in the air meant. Without hesitation, he threw on his soaked cloak, mounted the sturdiest horse in the stable, and charged into the storm. This was no ordinary ride. The paths he'd known since childhood had become treacherous rivers, swallowing stones and trees whole. Yet Aldrich pressed on, his voice raw from shouting warnings to every farmhouse he passed. When his horse stumbled, throwing him into the churning water, he clawed his way back up, clinging to branches like lifelines. By the time he reached the monastery gates, his hands were bloody, his breath ragged. But his warning came just in time. The monks rallied, moving precious manuscripts to the upper floors, shepherding villagers into the chapel's highest tower. By dawn, the floodwaters lapped at the altar steps, but not a single life was lost. What makes Aldrich's story extraordinary isn't just his bravery, but the precision of his knowledge. He didn't just act on instinct. He understood the river's patterns, the way certain bends in the land amplified danger. In an era without maps or weather science, that intimate familiarity with the earth was as vital as any weapon. And his legacy didn't end there. The monastery's records show how survivors, inspired by his example, began marking safe routes on makeshift wooden tablets, an early form of disaster planning passed down through generations. Consider the weight of his choice. Aldrich could have fled to higher ground himself. Instead, he turned toward the danger, knowing each second counted. That's the heart of these medieval survival stories, not just the courage to act, but the wisdom to act right, even when every instinct screams to run. In a world where nature's fury was as mysterious as it was deadly, people like Aldrich became living compasses, guiding others through the storm. And though we've traded horses for satellites since then, his lesson remains. True safety isn't just about saving yourself. It's about who you bring with you. The air smelled of charred wood and desperation as Heinrich gripped his hammer, his knuckles white against the soot-darkened metal. It was the summer of 1289, and the forests around his German village had become an inferno, the flames licking at the edges of homes like starving beasts. While others scrambled to flee, Heinrich stood frozen for just a moment, not in fear, but in calculation. He'd spent his life bending metal to his will, understanding how heat moved, how it could be redirected. And in that instant, he saw not just destruction, but a chance to fight back. With a roar that rivaled the fire itself, Heinrich rallied the villagers. They hacked at the earth with plow blades and axes, carving a jagged trench between the flames and the thatched roofs. But Heinrich knew dirt alone wouldn't stop a blaze this fierce. He sprinted to his forge, returning with armfuls of scrap metal, discarded horseshoes, broken plowshares, anything that could withstand the heat. Working faster than he'd ever moved, he arranged the metal in a jagged line, creating a barrier that would steal the fire's oxygen. Then came the riskiest stroke. Using his bellows to blast controlled bursts of air, he manipulated the flames like a puppeteer, forcing them away from the village and back toward the already burned forest. What saved the village that day wasn't just brute strength, it was Heinrich's intimate knowledge of how fire behaved. He'd spent years watching how molten metal cooled, how drafts could be harnessed or stifled. That expertise turned a blacksmith into a savior, and his legacy lived on. For generations afterward, villagers kept a cache of scrap metal near the forest's edge, ready to recreate his firebreak at the first sign of smoke. This wasn't just a story of survival, it was a lesson in how specialized skills could rewrite fate. While knights and nobles often dominated the history books, it was the craftsmen like Heinrich, those who understood the hidden rhythms of their trades, who held communities together when disaster struck. His courage wasn't blind, it was sharpened by years at the anvil, each strike of his hammer a silent rehearsal for the day he'd face a different kind of fire. And in that moment when the world burned around him, he proved something timeless. Sometimes the tools that build can also be the ones that save. The waves lapped lazily against the docks of Venice that morning, but Marco the sailor felt a knot tighten in his stomach. It wasn't the calm that unsettled him, it was the silence. The gulls that usually shrieked over the harbor had vanished. The stray dogs that nosed through the fish markets were gone, as if the city itself had been emptied of life. Marco had spent 30 years reading the sea's moods, and this was a language he understood. Nature's sharpest warnings often came in whispers. When he rushed to the square, his warnings were met with laughter. "The sky is clear," scoffed a fishmonger. "Superstitious fool," muttered a merchant, but Marco had seen this before. The way crabs scuttled inland days before a storm, how dolphins fled shallow waters when the currents turned treacherous. This time the signs were darker. He'd watched the tide recede too quickly at dawn, leaving boats tilted like broken toys in the mud. Now the harbor's surface shimmered with an unnatural stillness, as if the sea was holding its breath. With no time to convince the doubters, Marco turned to what he could control. He sprinted through the alleys of his own neighborhood, pounding on doors, dragging neighbors from their homes. Some came willingly, trusting the salt-weathered man who'd repaired their roofs after winter squalls. Others he bribed with promises of wine, or outright carried like old Signora Bianca, who cursed him until she saw the first wave cresting in the distance. By the time the water struck, Marco's street was empty, its residents huddled in the attic of the basilica, listening to the sea swallow their homes below. What's chilling about Marco's story isn't just his foresight, it's how easily disaster could have claimed them all. Venice had no seismographs, no tsunami sirens. Survival hinged on the sharp eyes of those who knew the land's secret language, and Marco spoke it fluently. His knowledge wasn't written in books, it was etched in the calluses of his hands, the way he could taste a storm brewing hours before the clouds rolled in. The aftermath revealed the full scope of his courage. While nobles debated divine punishment and scholars scratched their heads, the fishermen Marco had saved began teaching their children new rules. Watch the animals. Trust the old ones. Remember how Marco ran toward the water when everyone else would have fled. His legacy wasn't just lives saved that day. It was a shift in how an entire city listened to the world around them. Because sometimes the difference between life and death isn't technology or titles. It's the quiet voice of someone who knows the Earth's true name and the courage to shout when others refuse to hear. The convent walls should have been a barrier against the outside world, a place of quiet prayer and safety. But in the year 1348, no stone could keep out the horror creeping through Europe. Sister Marguerite knew the moment she saw the first dark blemish on a visiting merchant's neck the plague had come to their doorstep. Most would have barred the gates, desperate to keep death at bay. Marguerite did the unthinkable. She ordered the doors thrown wide. Her decision wasn't reckless, it was revolutionary. While panic gripped nearby towns, the convent transformed into a beacon of order amid chaos. Marguerite divided the sprawling cloister into precise sections, quarantine zones for the feverish, clean chambers for convalescents, even a separate kitchen where herbs were stewed into pain-relieving tonics. She enforced rules no one had imagined. Caregivers washed their hands in vinegar before touching patients. Linens were boiled in cauldrons of rosemary and salt. The sickest were given space near open windows where fresh air might soothe their labored breathing. These weren't just acts of kindness, they were early glimmers of medical logic, centuries ahead of their time. What made Marguerite extraordinary wasn't just her compassion, but her ability to marry it with cold, clear strategy. When local lords abandoned their people, she organized rotating teams of nuns to scour abandoned homes for survivors. When gravediggers refused to touch the dead, she taught her sisters to wrap bodies in linen soaked in juniper oil, reducing the risk to those who carried them. Even in grief, she found purpose collecting names of the deceased so their families might someday know their fate. The convent's records tell a startling truth. While nearby villages lost half their populations, Marguerite's methods kept the death toll among her patients to 1 in 3. But numbers alone don't capture her real legacy. In a time when plague victims were often left to die in the streets, she gave them something radical: dignity. A clean bed, a hand to hold, the murmured words of a prayer when speech failed them. Her story forces us to ask, what does true courage look like in the face of invisible terror? Marguerite had no microscope to see the enemy, no understanding of germs or transmission. Yet she grasped something profound, that survival wasn't just about avoiding death, but about refusing to let humanity wither in its shadow. Long after the last fever broke, her convent's ledgers remained, filled not just with tallies of the saved and lost, but with meticulous notes on which treatments eased suffering most. These scraps of parchment became lifelines for future outbreaks, proof that even in history's darkest hours, light persists, not by chance, but because someone like Marguerite dared to strike the match. The ground had been restless for days, subtle tremors that made chickens cluck nervously and sent dogs whimpering under tables. But in the small Italian village of Montepietro, no one paid much attention until Luca the farmer rigged up his peculiar warning system. He wasn't a scholar or an engineer, just a man who'd spent 40 years watching the land's smallest whispers. When he noticed the way his copper cooking pots swayed slightly before each tremor, he saw opportunity where others saw only oddity. Luca's design was deceptively simple. He hung rows of clay pots from the beams of his barn, each suspended by a thin rope with a small bell attached. The slightest vibration would send them clinking together, the sound carrying farther than any human shout. But his real genius lay in the pattern. Pots at different heights caught tremors at varying intensities, giving villagers a gradient of warning. A single bell might mean, check your supplies. A chorus meant, run now. When the earth finally split open one autumn night, it was Luca's cacophony of ringing that sent families tumbling into the fields just before their homes crumpled like dried parchment. What's remarkable isn't just that it worked, it's how Luca's system spread. Neighboring villages adapted his idea, adding their own refinements. Fishermen strung nets with chimes that echoed over water. Shepherds tied bells to their goats' collars, creating mobile alarm systems across grazing lands. Within a generation, the region had developed layered defenses, from Luca's humble pots to stone towers where watchmen monitored pendulum-like stones that amplified faint tremors. This wasn't merely survival, it was medieval crowdsourcing at its finest. Without formal education or technology, Luca had tapped into something profound, the power of observation married to action. His legacy wasn't just in the lives saved that night. but in proving that innovation thrives where need meets curiosity. Today's earthquake early warning systems with their satellites and algorithms owe an unconscious debt to a farmer who understood that sometimes the simplest tools speak the clearest truth if we're wise enough to listen. The wheat harvest had failed for the third straight year, and the streets of 14th century Lyon smelled of desperation. Jacques the baker watched from his shop window as hollow-eyed children picked through rubbish piles, their ribs visible beneath threadbare tunics. What twisted his gut wasn't just the hunger, it was the sight of merchant carts rumbling toward the grain warehouses, their loads destined for the tables of nobles who'd paid triple prices without blinking. The city's laws were clear. No one could sell flour below the guild's fixed rate, not even to the starving. But Jacques had spent his life measuring morality in scoops and handfuls, not coins. That night, while the guild elders slept, he fired up his ovens, not for the usual golden loaves that fetched good silver, but for dense, dark bread stretched with ground acorns and barley, baked in unmarked batches. His apprentices became silent couriers, slipping bundles to widows' doorsteps, leaving stacks near the churchyard where orphans gathered. When rumors spread of a shadowy baker flouting the rules, Jacques didn't stop, he adapted. He taught mothers to recognize his secret mark, a tiny cross scored into the crust, visible only to those who knew to look. The real turning point came when a guild inspector arrived unannounced, sniffing for evidence. Jacques played the obedient tradesman, offering samples of his overpriced, official loaves while beneath the counter. His youngest daughter passed baskets to a network of street urchins who'd become his distribution army. The inspector left satisfied, the hungry kept eating. Jacques' defiance wasn't reckless, it was calculated. He knew exactly how much he could lose to imagined rats or spoiled flour before arousing suspicion. His ledgers showed just enough profit to avoid scrutiny, while his real accounting lived in the grateful press of a grandmother's hand, or the way a shoemaker's son finally stopped crying himself to sleep. What makes his story extraordinary isn't the scale. He couldn't feed the whole city, but the precision of his rebellion. While knights earned glory on battlefields, Jacques waged war with every sack of flour smuggled into the slums, every loaf that carried not just nourishment, but proof that someone refused to accept cruelty as law. When famine finally loosened its grip, Lyon's records showed something curious. While other neighborhoods had graves stacked 3 deep, Jacques' parish had remarkably few. No monument marks his deeds, just a single line in a guild complaint about unaccounted grain wastage that somehow coincided with fewer dead. His legacy whispers through history a simple truth. Sometimes the bravest battles aren't fought with swords but with secrets. And the most powerful revolutions begin not with shouts, but with the quiet tearing of bread shared in the dark. The water had always been both neighbor and nemesis in the low-lying Dutch countryside, where every spring brought the same dread of overflowing dikes and ruined harvests. But in the village of Zerichsee, one man saw beyond the cycle of destruction. His name is lost to history, just the architect in town ledgers. Yet his legacy towers in the very bones of the homes he redesigned. Where others built to withstand a single flood, he engineered for the next 10. His breakthrough wasn't some grand invention, but a simple shift in perspective. Instead of fighting the water, he learned its rhythms. Homes under his direction rose on man-made mounds, their foundations stacked with layers of crushed shells and peat that absorbed moisture like a sponge. Cellars were built above ground, doubling as storage in dry months and buoyant chambers when the floods came. Even the staircases told a story, angled steeply to save space, yes, but also positioned to become emergency ladders if water rushed in. The true test came in 1322, when a storm surge shattered the region's aging dikes. Neighboring villages became islands of wreckage, their houses collapsing like soggy bread. But Xerxes' elevated homes stood firm, their upper floors dry enough to shelter refugees from miles around. The architect hadn't just saved buildings, he'd created a blueprint for collective survival. What's astonishing is how his ideas spread. Farmers adapted his mound technique for livestock pens, raising sheep folds on earthen platforms. Town councils mandated that new buildings place their heaviest beams parallel to the river's flow, letting floodwaters pass through rather than smash against solid walls. These weren't mandates from some far-off king, they were grassroots innovations, copied and improved upon by ordinary people who'd seen proof that disaster could be outthought. The architect's genius lay in understanding that resilience wasn't about strength alone, but about flexibility. His designs acknowledged what terrified others to admit: the water would return. By building for adaptation rather than resistance, he turned helplessness into strategy. Centuries later, modern engineers still study the faint sketches found in Xerxes' archives, marveling at how much this nameless visionary grasped without satellites or computer models. His lesson echoes through time. Sometimes the bravest act isn't holding back the tide, it's learning how to rise with it. The snow had a language, and old Thomas the shepherd understood every whisper. It wasn't just the depth that worried him that February morning in the Swiss Alps, it was the texture. The way the powder crunched under his boots with a hollow sound, like the earth itself was holding its breath. For 60 winters, he'd grazed his flocks on these slopes, learning how drifts curved around rocks, where hidden crevices lurked beneath innocent-looking blankets of white. So when he spotted the distant figures struggling through the pass merchants, by the look of their overloaded mules, his blood ran colder than the wind. They were heading straight for the bowl, a deceptively gentle dip that trapped avalanches like a cupped hand. Thomas didn't hesitate. He left his flock clustered safely on the windward ridge and plunged downhill, his voice raw from shouting warnings the travelers couldn't hear over the howling gale. When they finally noticed him waving his crook like a madman, they mistook him for a beggar until he grabbed the lead mule's bridle and pointed upward. There, barely visible against the glare, was the faintest ripple in the snow's surface. To the merchants, it meant nothing. To Thomas, it was a death sentence written in ice. What happened next wasn't just rescue, it was a masterclass in reading the land. Thomas led them not down, but sideways, tracing invisible contours only he could feel beneath his feet. At one heart-stopping moment, he made them crawl single file along a spine of rock no wider than a man's hand, their packs abandoned behind them. Minutes later, the bowl shattered with a roar, burying their belongings under tons of snow. But Thomas was already herding them toward an outcrop the locals called the Shepherd's Cradle, where the angle of the rock always kept one patch of ground clear. The merchants would later swear it was a miracle. Thomas knew better. Every step of that treacherous path mirrored the routes his sheep took instinctively, the same paths his father had taught him to follow before he could walk. This was wisdom carved not in books, but in generations of watching how snow clung to certain slopes and slid from others, how morning sun could turn a safe path treacherous by noon. His legacy lived on in the village's odd new tradition. Each winter, elders would walk the children up to the cradle and have them lie flat against the stone, listening for the subtle creaks that signaled unstable snow. No maps recorded these lessons. They passed mouth to ear like the alpine wind through pine needles. Yet when modern avalanche researchers finally studied the region centuries later, they found something astonishing. The folklore path shepherds used aligned almost perfectly with geological surveys of stable ground. Thomas's story forces us to ask, what other ancient knowledge have we dismissed as superstition? In an age of satellite forecasts and high-tech gear, we've forgotten how to listen to the land itself. His courage wasn't just in braving the storm, it was in trusting a lifetime of observation over the panic of the moment. And that's a lesson that echoes far beyond the mountains. Sometimes the oldest wisdom is the sharpest tool we have. The river had always been the lifeblood of the village until the day it turned traitor. After a landslide upstream, the water ran murky and thick, its surface shimmering with an unnatural iridescence. Fish floated belly up along the banks, and those foolish enough to drink reported burning throats and crippling stomach cramps within hours. Panic spread faster than the poison itself, but in a cramped workshop smelling of dried mint and iron, the apothecary Henric was already crushing leaves between his fingers, murmuring names older than Latin. Groundsel for cleansing, willow bark for pain, and oh, this is what we need. What looked like superstition to outsiders was, in fact, meticulous science passed down through generations. Henric knew which herbs could bind to toxins, which roots stimulated vomiting to purge the body, which flowers held antiseptic properties strong enough to counter rot. His potion wasn't magic, it was chemistry disguised as folklore, a recipe honed from centuries of observing how nature both harmed and healed. Working through the night, he distilled tinctures in glass jars, testing each batch on himself before declaring it safe. By dawn, villagers lined up outside his door, clutching buckets of tainted water. The real brilliance lay in his distribution. Henric didn't just hand out remedies, he taught. Mothers learned to identify yarrow growing near their cottages, its feathery leaves perfect for steeping into detoxifying tea. Farmers were shown how charcoal, normally used for cooking fires, could be ground and swallowed to absorb toxins. Even children had roles, gathering dandelions whose bitter roots stimulated liver function. Within days, the apothecary's knowledge became the village's armor, transforming every household into a frontline clinic. Modern tests would later reveal the landslide had unleashed arsenic-laced sediment into the water. Remarkably, Henric's brews contained compounds now known to mitigate heavy metal poisoning tannins that bound to arsenic, flavonoids that supported kidney function. His methods, once dismissed as old wives' tales, were proven effective by the one metric that mattered. Not a single death was recorded after his intervention. But his legacy wasn't just in the lives saved. It was in proving that wisdom often wears humble disguises. While scholars debated humors and miasma theory, this backcountry healer had unlocked a truth we're still relearning today. Sometimes the most advanced solutions are hidden in plain sight, whispered in the language of wind and leaf. His courage wasn't just in defying poison, it was in trusting knowledge that predated books, in bridging the gap between observation and action when the stakes couldn't have been higher. And in doing so, he left behind more than a remedy. He left a blueprint for listening to the earth when it speaks. The sun beat down on the cobbled streets of 14th century Valencia like a hammer on an anvil, turning the once lush orchards into crackling tinder. For 3 cruel summers, the rains had refused to come, and the river Turia shrank to a sickly trickle. Men fought over brackish puddles in the riverbed, while the wealthy hoarded private cisterns behind iron gates. Into this cauldron of desperation stepped Mayor Ramon de Villanova, a man who understood that survival wasn't just about water, but about the rules guarding every precious drop. His first act wasn't popular, but it was revolutionary. He declared all wells, even those on private estates, communal property, posting armed guards to ensure no one drew more than their allotted share. Families received ceramic tokens stamped with their household size, redeemable for specific quantities at designated hours. Cheaters faced not fines, but the loss of their entire ration, a punishment more feared than starvation itself. Meanwhile, Ramon's engineers scoured the city for forgotten knowledge, reviving Moorish-era underground channels called canats that siphoned hidden groundwater with eerie efficiency. But Ramon's real genius lay in transparency. Each morning, scribes painted the city's dwindling reserves on the plaza walls in bold red figures, turning abstraction into shared urgency. When a nobleman was caught bribing a well-guard, Ramon didn't jail him. He made the man distribute rations to the poorest barrio for a month, his silk sleeves rolled up in the dust. The message was clear: thirst would be democratic, or it would not be. By the drought's fourth year, neighboring towns had descended into chaos, fields burned, markets looted, children buried with parched lips. Valencia, though gaunt, stood intact. Ramon's ledgers tell the tale in stark numbers: 12,000 households fed, 89 wells kept flowing, 0 riots. No grand statues commemorate his deeds, just a single line in the city archives, noting how the death rate during those years remained no worse than ordinary times. What makes his story extraordinary isn't just the policies, but the philosophy behind them. In an age when kings ruled by divine right, Ramon governed by collective sacrifice. He proved that disaster doesn't create heroes, it reveals them in the unlikeliest of places. While others saw scarcity as a death sentence, he saw it as a design challenge, turning civic duty into a lifeline woven from equal parts ingenuity and iron will. His legacy whispers to us across centuries: the difference between chaos and survival isn't resources, it's the courage to share them. The collapse came without warning, a thunderous roar of timber and rock that plunged the Hungarian silver miners into utter darkness. For 12 men deep below the earth in 1423, the initial terror gave way to a chilling realization: no one knew they were trapped. Rescue might take weeks if it came at all. But what their would-be saviors didn't account for was the miners' intimate knowledge of the mountain's hidden anatomy. These weren't just laborers, they were subterranean cartographers who'd memorized every fissure and groan of the rock around them. Their first act defied all panic-driven instinct. They sat perfectly still, listening. The faintest trickle of water echoed from the northwest wall, a sound most would have missed, but to their trained ears it was a lifeline. Using picks forged from their own broken tools, they chiseled toward the sound with agonizing precision, not just seeking water, but following the airflow it created. One wrong strike could bring down more rock, so they worked in shifts, their movements measured like surgeons. When their fingers finally brushed the icy stream, they didn't just drink. They mapped its path upward, carving narrow channels to guide fresh air into their tomb. But their true innovation lay in what they did next. Realizing their candles would soon suffocate them, they snuffed all but one, preserving oxygen while using its smoke to test air currents. They marked safe zones where breath came easiest and danger areas where the smoke pooled thickly. Then came the most counterintuitive tactic of all. They slept in rotations, lowering their collective oxygen needs. While the outside world assumed them dead, the miners were conducting a masterclass in survival psychology, singing work songs to maintain rhythm, assigning tasks based on each man's strengths, even designating a hope keeper whose sole job was to recount stories of past rescues. Their ordeal lasted 19 days. When rescuers finally broke through, they found not corpses, but a meticulously organized camp. Water collected in helmet-shaped pools, air vents marked with chalk arrows, men whose gaunt faces still held the light of stubborn will. The mine's records show these weren't extraordinary men, just ordinary workers who turned daily routine into extraordinary discipline. They'd known which rocks rang hollow, signaling air pockets, which timbers could be repurposed as splints, even how to use silver ore itself as a primitive antibiotic for their wounds. What resonates across centuries isn't just their ingenuity, but their understanding of hierarchy in crisis. The strongest didn't hoard resources, they dug for the weak. The most skilled didn't dominate, they taught. In an age before survival manuals or emergency training, these miners demonstrated a truth we're still relearning today. Disaster strips away everything but character, and what remains is either your anchor or your downfall. Their legacy lives on in modern mine safety protocols, unknowingly echoing tricks devised in that lightless hell, proof that the human mind, when sharpened by necessity, can outcarve even the darkest stone. Smoke curled from the upper windows of the Abbey of St. Gall on that bitter winter night in 1482, carrying with it the acrid scent of centuries about to turn to ash. Brother Matthias, the monastery's head librarian, didn't even pause to wake the abbot. He knew the fire would consume their irreplaceable treasures before the bell could toll for help. The library wasn't just a room full of books. It was the beating heart of medieval scholarship, home to illuminated gospels painstakingly inked by monks' hands, ancient Greek texts preserved through the Dark Ages, and medical treatises containing knowledge not found anywhere else in Christendom. Matthias made a choice that would have been heresy in any other circumstance. He threw open the scriptorium doors and roused every novice, cook, and stable hand he could find. What followed wasn't just a rescue, it was a ballet of desperation and precision. Matthias organized his ragtag brigade into two lines, one passing manuscripts hand to hand out the burning library, the other dunking each salvaged volume in snowdrifts to halt smoldering edges. He'd spent 30 years memorizing the placement of every codex, knowing which works were too fragile to survive rough handling and which could endure a hurried escape. When the flames licked at the astronomy section, he shouted directions over the roar, the Hippocrates first, then the purple psalter, guiding hands like a general on a battlefield where every casualty was irreplaceable. The true miracle wasn't just the speed, but the method. Matthias had trained his assistants without realizing it. For years, he'd insisted they practice moving heavy liturgical objects during feast days, turning solemn processions into unconscious rehearsals for this moment. Now that muscle memory saved Aristotle's lost dialogues from becoming kindling. Even as embers singed his robe, Matthias spotted young brother Luca's hesitating before a collapsing shelf, not from fear, but because he couldn't read the labels. With a voice that cut through chaos, Matthias cried out page counts instead of titles. The 120-leaf one beneath the green ribbon. By dawn, when the last flame guttered out, the cost was devastating. Half the library's beams reduced to charcoal, the scent of vellum and oak gall ink replaced by ruin. Yet in the snow-dusted courtyard stood piles of volumes saved against all odds, their pages stiff with frost but intact. Matthias's hands were blistered, his eyebrows singed off, but his eyes burned with triumph. He hadn't just saved books, he'd preserved voices from the past that would go on to shape the Renaissance, ensuring Galen's medical wisdom would still heal centuries later, and that fragile maps of the stars would guide navigators to new worlds. This story forces us to reconsider what truly constitutes a life saved. While others rushed to rescue the Abbey's silver reliquaries, Matthias understood a deeper truth. Some flames consume more than flesh and timber. They erase the very ideas that make us human. His courage wasn't measured in breaths preserved, but in the unbroken chain of knowledge stretching backward to antiquity and forward into futures he'd never see. Today, when scholars pore over those same manuscripts in climate-controlled vaults, they're touching more than parchment, they're holding proof that one man's clarity of purpose can outshine even the brightest fire. The wind screamed through the gaps in the barn's walls like a living thing, tearing at the very beams that held the structure upright. Outside, the hurricane had already flattened half the village, sending roof tiles spinning like deadly discs through the air. Inside, by the flickering light of a single candle wedged between two stones, Agnes the midwife knelt in the straw, her hands steady despite the chaos. The laboring woman beneath her wasn't some noble's wife with silken sheets and a fire-warmed chamber. She was a shepherd's daughter, barely 16, her face contorted with fear as much as pain. And Agnes, who'd birthed hundreds of babies in her 60 years, knew this would be no ordinary delivery. What happened next wasn't just skill, it was artistry forged in crisis. With the barn's door ripped clean off its hinges, Agnes positioned her own body as a windbreak, letting the girl brace against her during contractions. She used strips of her own apron to tie down the trembling hay bales, creating a makeshift barrier against the storm's fury. When the candle guttered out, she didn't panic. She guided the girl's hands to feel the baby's crowning, turning terror into purpose. "You're the strongest thing in this storm," she murmured, her voice cutting through the howling wind like an anchor. "And this child will know it." Agnes's genius lay in her adaptability. No boiled water for cleansing. She used rainwater collected in a dented milk pail. No clean linen. She sacrificed her wimple, the last vestige of her dignity as the village's respected elder. And when the barn's central beam cracked with a sound like Judgment Day, she didn't flinch, just rolled the girl onto her side, sheltering both mother and newborn with her own body as debris rained around them. What makes this story extraordinary isn't just the physical feat, but the emotional alchemy Agnes performed. In the span of that endless night, she transformed a scene of primal fear into something sacred. The girl would later swear she heard angels singing when her baby's first cry pierced the storm, though it was just Agnes humming an old lullaby between her teeth as she tied the umbilical cord with a strand of her own hair. This was the hidden backbone of medieval survival, not just knights and kings, but the quiet mastery of women like Agnes, whose knowledge was passed hand to hand like a precious flame. Midwives were the era's untitled physicians, carrying remedies in their apron pockets and anatomical wisdom in their fingertips. They understood that courage wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was simply refusing to let life be extinguished, no matter how fiercely the wind howled. The barn didn't survive the night, but Agnes's legacy did, in the healthy boy who grew up to be a carpenter, in the young mother who later apprenticed as a healer, and in the village that began storing birthing supplies in storm cellars after that day. No monuments were raised to Agnes, no ballads sung in taverns, but centuries later, when archaeologists unearthed that very farmstead, they found something curious. The foundation stones of the rebuilt barn were arranged in the shape of a womb, an unspoken tribute to the night the storm met its match. The rain hadn't stopped for 40 days, not the gentle kind that nourishes crops, but the relentless deluge that turns rivers into monsters. By the time Sir Godfrey and his men rode into the valley, the only bridge connecting a dozen villages to the granaries of the north lay in ruins, its stones scattered downstream like broken teeth. Starvation had already begun creeping into the cottages, hollowing out cheeks and silencing children's laughter. What happened next would etch Godfrey's name not into battle chronicles, but into the quiet annals of lives saved by unconventional courage. A lesser knight might have seen only the mission ahead, some lord's petty border dispute further up the road. But Godfrey had spent enough winters in these hills to know hunger didn't wait for wars to end. With a single sharp command, he redirected his armored column not toward glory, but toward the muddy wreckage of the bridge. His men exchanged baffled glances. Soldiers build siege engines, not civic infrastructure. Yet within hours, the clang of hammers replaced the clatter of swords as Godfrey's company became an impromptu engineering corps. The real brilliance lay in how he leveraged every resource. Chainmail-clad knights waded into the frigid current, using their shields as makeshift barges to ferry stones. Squires, more accustomed to polishing armor, now mixed mortar with their bare hands. Even the war horses found new purpose, dragging fallen timbers into place with their harnesses. Godfrey himself worked alongside them, his surcoat splattered with mud, directing repairs with the same precision he'd once reserved for battlefield maneuvers. What transformed this from mere labor to legend was Godfrey's understanding of systems. He didn't just rebuild the bridge, he reinvented its function. The original narrow crossing had bottlenecked supplies for years. Now his team widened it, adding recesses for carts to pass each other. They dug drainage channels to prevent future floods from undermining the foundations, a trick learned from observing Roman ruins. Most crucially, Godfrey posted rotating guards to manage the flow of traffic, ensuring precious grain reached the hungriest villages first. The impact rippled far beyond that single act. When news reached the local lord, he didn't punish Godfrey for deviating from orders. He commissioned bridges across the region using the same designs. Peasants who'd once crossed themselves at the sight of armed knights now brought baskets of mushrooms to the soldiers at their makeshift forge. And years later, when another flood came, it wasn't the bridge that failed, but the crumbling granaries upstream, a lesson that spurred Godfrey's next unlikely campaign. This story shatters the stereotype of medieval knights as mere brute force. Godfrey's leadership wasn't about swinging the heaviest sword, but about recognizing when to lay down the sword entirely. His legacy whispers a timeless truth. Real strength isn't just overcoming enemies, but reimagining what it means to serve. In an age obsessed with conquest, he proved that sometimes the mightiest armor is simply a willingness to get your hands dirty, and that the bridges we build can outlast the battles we win. The sea didn't roar, it inhaled. One moment, the villagers of Dunwich were mending nets and haggling over the day's catch. The next, the harbor vanished beneath a sucking void as the water retreated far beyond the tide line. Old Finn the fisherman dropped his knife mid-splice, his leathery face going slack. He'd heard tales from his grandfather about the ocean's breath pulling back like this before a wave taller than church steeples came crashing in. There was no time for panic, only action. Finn's boat was already splinters against the quay when the water returned with a vengeance, swallowing the lower streets whole. From his perch on the grain store's roof, he watched neighbors clinging to chimney stacks, their shouts drowned by the churn below. What saved them wasn't some grand rescue vessel, it was Finn's lifetime of making do. He'd spent 50 years repairing nets with whatever twine he could scavenge, patching hulls with driftwood and tar. Now, as floating debris spun in the whirlpool's barrel staves, broken cartwheels, even a widow's oak dresser, he saw not wreckage but raw materials. Working faster than he'd ever gutted a fish, Finn knotted rope salvaged from floating fishing traps around anything buoyant enough to hold weight. His fingers bled as he lashed together a jagged mosaic of survival. Salt-crusted planks became a platform, bloated sheepskins tied beneath added lift. Even a tangle of fishing baskets woven between gaps kept children from slipping through. The first raft looked like madness until it held 6 gasping souls, Finn steering them toward higher ground with nothing but a broken oar, but his true genius lay in delegation. As survivors reached temporary safety, he didn't just build more rafts, he taught others the tricks. A butcher's apprentice realized belt leather could reinforce weak joints. A cooper's widow showed how barrel hoops could frame floating walkways. Within hours, the village's destruction became its salvation, every scrap repurposed with collective ingenuity. What resonates across 6 centuries isn't just the rafts, but the philosophy behind them. Finn didn't wait for perfect solutions. He used what the disaster itself provided. When the king's inspectors later surveyed the damage, they noted with astonishment how Dunwich's death toll was half that of wealthier towns despite having no stone towers for refuge. The reason was scribbled in the margin of their report: the poor man's navy, a fleet born from desperate creativity. Finn's legacy lived on in the oddest places. Generations later, Dunwich's children played a game called storm rigging, competing to build miniature rafts from flotsam. It seemed like idle amusement until another tidal surge hit in 1620, and elders recognized the patterns their grandparents had drilled into them. True resilience, Finn proved, isn't about what you have when calm seas prevail. It's about seeing the tools hidden in the tempest itself. The mountain had spoken with a voice of fire, blanketing the villages beneath it in a shroud of ash that turned noon into twilight. When Sister Beatrice arrived in the aftermath, she found children who hadn't spoken in weeks, their eyes hollow, their hands clutching at nothing, as if the earth's fury had stolen their words along with their homes. The physical destruction was obvious: collapsed roofs, poisoned wells, fields buried under grey waste, but Beatrice saw the deeper wreckage. These children didn't need bread or blankets half as much as they needed someone to help them make sense of a world that could betray them so violently. Her solution was radical in its simplicity. She gathered the youngest survivors each dusk in the charred remains of the abbey's garden and told them stories. Not pious parables of saints, but wild, twisting tales where mountains wept molten tears and heroes outsmarted the anger of the gods. Night after night, she wove narratives where disaster wasn't the end, just a turn in the road. A boy who'd watched his family's sheep perish in the pyroclastic flow became the shepherd in her story who taught the mountain gentleness. A girl too terrified to sleep became the brave explorer who tamed fire with her shadow. What made Beatrice's methods extraordinary wasn't just the storytelling, it was her instinct for psychological scaffolding. She noticed which children flinched at loud noises and taught them to mimic the rumble with their own voices, turning fear into play. When a toddler kept drawing the eruption over and over, Beatrice didn't chastise him. She handed him fresh charcoal and asked, "What does the mountain look like when it's happy?" Slowly, the children began stitching their trauma into narratives where they weren't victims, but protagonists. Modern therapists would recognize her techniques as groundbreaking: narrative exposure therapy, somatic grounding, even elements of cognitive behavioral intervention, all practiced 400 years before psychology had names for them. Beatrice's diary, discovered centuries later in the abbey's ruins, contained observations that still resonate. Grief needs a container. Give it a story and it becomes bearable. Leave it formless and it drowns the soul. Her legacy lived on in unexpected ways. Generations later, when earthquakes shook the region, elders repeated Beatrice's tales almost verbatim, adding new layers with each retelling. The stories became a kind of communal immune system, helping children process fresh disasters through the lens of those who'd survived before. No one erected statues to Beatrice. Her monument was the way a village lullaby still carried echoes of her volcano tale, proof that the bravest healers don't just treat wounds, they rewrite the stories we tell about our scars. The roads were lined with skeletons, not the grim remains of the dead, but the living, their bones pressing against skin stretched tight from hunger. Famine had carved through the Lombardy region like a scythe, leaving villages so desperate they boiled shoe leather for broth. Yet in the bustling port of Genoa, merchant Enrico Doria faced a different kind of crisis. His warehouses bulged with Sicilian grain, enough to fetch triple the usual price from wealthy buyers across the Alps. The ledger in his hands whispered of fortunes to be made, but the memory of his own childhood, when a single loaf had meant the difference between life and death, stirred something deeper than greed. What happened next defied every expectation of medieval commerce. Enrico didn't just donate a token shipment, he rewrote his entire business model. his fleet of mule-drawn carts, usually laden with silks and spices for noble clients, now groaned under sacks of barley and rye. He hired extra guards not to protect against bandits, but to prevent panicked mobs from overturning wagons in their desperation, most radical of all. He sold the grain at cost, refusing to profit from misery. When competitors scoffed that he'd bankrupt himself, Enrico made his stance clear. A man who grows fat while his neighbors starve is no merchant, he's a vulture. The true brilliance lay in his logistics. Enrico knew famine wasn't just about scarcity, it was about distribution. While others dumped grain in central squares where the strongest hoarded it, he sent carts down goat paths to remote hamlets others had forgotten. His drivers carried census lists borrowed from monasteries, ensuring widows and orphans received shares before local strongmen could intervene. And in a stroke of quiet genius, he mixed lesser grains like millet into the flour, not to cheat, but to stretch supplies further without sacrificing nutrition. Records from the time reveal something astonishing. Villages along Enrico's routes had survival rates double those of areas relying on traditional relief. His methods sparked imitation. Rival merchants, shamed by his example, began setting aside portions of their shipments for charity. Even the church took note, adopting his distribution models during later crises. Yet Enrico's greatest legacy might be the ledger entry found after his death. A single-line item marked "Debts Forgiven," listing hundreds of peasant families who'd never repay their grain loans. This story shatters the myth that medieval commerce was purely cutthroat. Enrico proved that supply chains could be lifelines, that profit and compassion weren't mutually exclusive. In an age before corporate social responsibility, he demonstrated how commerce at its best doesn't just move goods, it binds communities. His carts carried more than grain. They carried the radical idea that wealth isn't measured in coin alone, but in the lives it sustains when the world turns barren. The river reeked of death, not from corpses, but from the slow rot creeping through the water itself. Plague had come to Toulouse in 1349, and with it, a new horror. The wells and streams that once quenched thirst now carried invisible poison. Fearful villagers drank wine until the cellars ran dry, then resorted to lapping at puddles like animals. But in a smoke-blackened workshop at the edge of town, Potter Guillaume Rouillard squinted at a lump of wet clay in his hands, seeing something no one else could, a solution shaped by centuries of craft. Guillaume knew clay's secrets better than most. For 30 years, he'd molded jugs that kept water cool in summer and mugs that didn't crack by winter fires. Now, as sickness stalked the streets, he noticed something curious. Houses using his porous butter jars for water storage had fewer cases of fever. It wasn't magic. The unglazed clay filtered impurities as liquid seeped through microscopic gaps. What began as an accident of craftsmanship became a lifeline. Working feverishly, Guillaume redesigned his entire production line, throwing shallow, wide-mouthed bowls with walls deliberately crafted to strain contaminants. He layered them with sand and crushed charcoal from the bakery's ovens, creating a crude but effective filtration system. The true innovation, however, lay in distribution. Guillaume didn't hoard his discovery. He turned the town's children into his apprentices. For a handful of lentils, kids carried his filters door to door, teaching families to pour water through multiple layers, each stage removing more filth. When demand outstripped his workshop's capacity, he did the unthinkable. He published his designs, not in Latin for scholars, but sketched in charcoal on the side of the tannery, where any passing artisan could replicate them. Within weeks, potters across the region adapted their kilns for what became known as plague jars, some adding crushed herbs for scent, others refining the pour size through trial and error. Modern tests on surviving fragments reveal how shockingly effective these filters were. The clay's natural minerals removed heavy metals, while the charcoal neutralized toxins. But Guillaume's greatest contribution wasn't technical, it was social. In an era when guilds guarded trade secrets like gold, his willingness to share knowledge created a grassroots public health network. Records show mortality rates in neighborhoods using the filters dropped by nearly half compared to adjacent areas. What makes this story extraordinary isn't just the invention, but the inventor's humility. Guillaume never claimed divine inspiration or sought royal patents. He simply applied a craftsman's intimate knowledge of materials to a problem others thought unsolvable. His legacy lingers in the unlikeliest places: the water filters used by modern hikers, the ceramic purification tablets distributed in disaster zones, even the porous planters urban gardeners use today. All carry faint echoes of a medieval potter who understood that sometimes salvation isn't forged in grand laboratories, but shaped by calloused hands and an unwavering belief that every community deserves clean water. The storm rolled in like a runaway siege engine, splitting the sky with jagged streaks of light that set the thatch ablaze before the first raindrops even fell. When lightning struck the crowded market square of 14th century Tours, it wasn't just the immediate blast that maimed, it was the aftermath. Dozens lay writhing on the cobblestones, their skin seared by the same heavenly fire that had ignited wooden stalls around them. With the town's lone physician away treating a noble's gout, hope arrived in the form of an unlikely savior, Margaret the herb wife, her apron already stained with crushed greenery as she pushed through the panicked crowd. What happened next wasn't just folk medicine, it was battlefield triage refined through generations of quiet observation. Margaret knew what the university-trained doctors often dismissed: that honey, thick and golden from her own hives, created a sterile barrier no linen bandage could match. As others screamed for leeches or prayer, she worked with methodical calm, slathering the sticky salve over weeping burns to seal out infection. But her true genius lay in the layers beneath poultices of crushed plantain leaves to reduce swelling, compresses soaked in witch hazel to numb agony, even a daring infusion of poppy extract measured drop by careful drop to ease the worst suffering without stopping breath altogether. Critics would later sneer at her peasant remedies, yet the results defied argument, where conventional treatments of the era, cauterization with hot irons or suffocating plasters of egg white and flour, often doomed patients to gangrene. Margaret's methods left survivors with pink, healing flesh beneath their honeyed dressings. Her knowledge wasn't scribbled in Latin texts but passed mouth to ear through a chain of midwives and woodsfolk. How yarrow could staunch bleeding, how comfrey sped bone knitting, how certain mosses held moisture better than the finest imported silks. The real revolution, however, came in the weeks that followed. Rather than hoard her secrets, Margaret trained the town's women in batches, turning kitchens into apothecaries and cider presses into herb distilleries. When a skeptical priest demanded proof of her divine mandate, she simply pointed to the children playing in the square again, their scars fading under the summer sun. By harvest season, what began as desperation had become protocol. Farmers kept beehives near their fields, not just for sweetness, but for the pharmacy in their wax. Modern labs would later confirm what Margaret's patients knew instinctively. The enzymes in raw honey combat bacteria, the tannins in oak bark reduce inflammation, the very acidity of crushed cranberries prevents wound rot. Yet her legacy isn't just in the science she anticipated, but in the paradigm she overturned. In an age when healing was increasingly confined to male scholars and their leather-bound tomes, this illiterate woman proved wisdom could bloom as freely as the weeds she harvested, rooted not in parchment, but in the patient rhythm of watching, trying, and remembering. The next time lightning struck Tours, they didn't wait for a doctor. They sent for the bees. The smoke turned daylight into a choking twilight, its acrid bite making every breath feel like swallowing fire. 9-year-old Alette should have been fleeing with the others when the forest fire swept toward her village, but she hesitated at the edge of the clearing, her bare feet rooted to the scorched earth. Behind her, old Master Laurent stumbled blindly, his walking stick catching on roots he couldn't see. Beyond him, 4 more of the village blind residents clutched at each other, their faces turned toward the roar of flames with expressions of pure terror. In that moment, Alette made a choice that defied every instinct to run. She turned back. What happened next wasn't just rescue, it was a masterpiece of spatial memory. While others saw only chaos, Alette navigated the burning woods with eerie precision, calling out landmarks her feet remembered even as her eyes watered from smoke. That moss-covered boulder where she'd hidden from chores, now a waypoint guiding them left. The gnarled oak with the hive her brother once raided, a signal to duck low. She'd spent her childhood weaving through these trees, playing games that required her to map every dip and hollow in her mind. Now that play became survival. The true brilliance lay in her adaptations. When flames blocked the main path to the creek, their only hope of refuge, Alette didn't panic. She recalled the deer trail that looped behind the blackberry thicket, a route so narrow they had to shuffle sideways, hands linked in a human chain. With embers raining down like hellish snow, she made the blind villagers mimic her movements. Step where I step, the ground sounds hollow here, that means soft earth, so skip wide. At one heart-stopping moment, she even used her own body as a bridge, lying across a smoldering log so they could cross without burning their feet. What makes Alette's story extraordinary isn't just her courage, but how she transformed childhood skills into life-saving tools. While adults relied on sight, she trusted touch, pressing palms to tree bark to judge heat levels, feeling for vibrations that signaled unstable ground. Her voice became their compass, singing the same rhyming ditty she'd used in hide and seek to keep them calm and moving. By the time they reached the creek's shallow safety, her feet were blistered, her braids singed at the ends, but every soul she'd guided could still draw breath. This wasn't just a tale of quick thinking, it was proof that heroism wears no age. In the aftermath, when villagers rebuilt, they carved notches along the forest paths, marking Alette's escape route, a permanent testament to how play prepares us for more than we know. Generations later, children in that region still learn blind walks, games that sharpen memory and touch, because sometimes the difference between life and death isn't strength or status, it's the quiet power of knowing the world by heart and having the courage to lead when others can't see the way. The parchment crinkled under Brother Anselm's fingers as he smoothed the latest letter from Cluny Abbey, its edges frayed from months of travel across rutted roads and storm-lashed passes. At first glance, it was just another theological debate, but tucked between lines of scripture lay something far more urgent: precise instructions for reinforcing vaulted ceilings against earthquakes, sketched by a monk who'd survived the collapse of his own chapel. This was the hidden lifeline of medieval Europe, not royal decrees or merchant caravans, but an underground postal service of survival wisdom, scribbled in monastery scriptoria from Canterbury to Constantinople. What began as simple correspondence between scholars evolved into something revolutionary. When floods swallowed a Belgian abbey's crops, its monks didn't just pray, they documented which root vegetables resisted rot in waterlogged soil, sending the findings to coastal communities. After a fire ravaged the library at Monte Cassino, survivors compiled lists of texts too fragile to save, warning others to duplicate them first. Even seemingly trivial details found purpose. A Bavarian monk's note about storing grain with dried mint to deter rats became gospel for villages battling plague-induced shortages. The true genius lay in their system. Each abbey served as both student and teacher, adding local innovations before passing the knowledge onward like a bucket brigade across centuries. This wasn't just information sharing, it was crowdsourced disaster science centuries before the term existed. Monks developed standardized symbols for speed. A tiny wave in the margin signaled flood advice, a flame denoted fire prevention methods. They even created primitive version control, scratching out disproven remedies like hanging garlic to ward off pestilence while preserving what worked. The network's reach was staggering. A Welsh monastery's cure for smoke inhalation, based on steaming thyme leaves, reached Hungarian miners within 2 years via this slow but relentless relay. Modern emergency responders would recognize their methods instinctively. The monks grasped that survival depends not just on individual bravery, but on institutional memory. When Krakau's scribes received word of a bridge design that withstood ice flows, they didn't hoard the knowledge, they recopied it into 20 identical letters, sending them down river like seeds on the wind. Their legacy lives on in unexpected places. The dotted lines tracing modern disaster relief routes often follow medieval pilgrimage paths, and the very concept of best practices echoes their meticulous cross-referencing of which solutions worked where and why. Perhaps the most poignant testament to their system lies in the Vienna Codex, a battered volume containing 300 years of disaster notes. Its last entry, scribbled as the Black Death encircled the city in 1349, reads simply, "To those who come after, we have failed." But somewhere in these pages may lie what you need to succeed. That fragile thread of shared hope, passed hand to trembling hand through history's darkest hours, proves something timeless. Civilization isn't built on stone or steel, but on the stubborn belief that someone, someday, will need what we've learned. The goats should have been grazing. That was the first thing old Tomas noticed when he stepped into the dawn-lit pasture. Instead, they huddled together like soldiers preparing for battle, their hooves stamping the dew-heavy grass into mud. Even his usually placid milk cow stood rigid, her ears twitching at sounds Tomas couldn't hear. For 50 harvests, he'd learned to read the land's subtle language, the way crows circled before a storm, how ants built higher mounds when floods threatened. But this was different. The animals weren't just restless, they were terrified, their wide eyes reflecting a dread deeper than any wolf's approach. Tomas didn't wait for the priest's bells or the mayor's decree. He dropped his scythe and ran toward the village square, his lungs burning as he shouted warnings to every cottage he passed. Some laughed, calling him a superstitious fool. Others crossed themselves and hurried inside. But when the baker's wife saw Tomas's dog cowering under her kneading table, a beast that had faced down wild boars without flinching, she grabbed her children and ran. By the time the earth convulsed an hour later, splitting the wheat fields like overripe fruit, the village was already evacuating to the stone chapel on the hill. What makes this story extraordinary isn't just the animals' prescience. Modern science now knows they detect infrasound and electromagnetic changes before quakes, but Tomas's refusal to dismiss their behavior as coincidence. In an era when most saw livestock as dumb beasts, he recognized them as partners in survival. After the quake, when others marveled at the chapel's untouched walls, Tomas knelt in the ruined pasture, pressing his palm to the cracked soil where his goats had stood. Their instincts had woven an invisible lifeline, and he'd been humble enough to listen. The village didn't just rebuild after that day, they relearned. Children were tasked with observing the chickens' dust-bathing rituals for signs of unease. Shepherds kept logs of their flock's sudden panics, noting which preceded tremors. Even the skeptical mayor began hosting animal councils where farmers shared odd behaviors over ale. Thomas's legacy wasn't in the stones of the new barns, but in the way his neighbors finally understood. Survival sometimes wears a fleece or feathers, and wisdom isn't always spoken in words. Generations later, seismologists studying the region's archives found something astonishing. Local records of animal behavior predicted quakes with uncanny accuracy, centuries before instruments could do the same. Yet the deepest lesson lies not in the science, but in the choice of one farmer to trust creatures society deemed beneath notice. Because when the earth itself turns traitor, sometimes the first alarm isn't a bell or a siren, but a goat's panicked cry and the courage to take it seriously. The plague masks with their long beaks and glass eyes have become the haunting symbol of medieval medicine, but history remembers the wrong healers. While wealthy physicians fled to country estates or prescribed useless amulets, the real battle against the Black Death was waged by nameless women in smoke-filled hovels, their hands raw from boiling vinegar washes and their aprons stiff with the sweat of the dying. These weren't trained doctors, they were brewers' widows who understood fermentation's cleansing power, midwives who'd seen how clean linens reduced childbed fever, and even prostitutes whose knowledge of herb poultices outstripped any university graduates. In a world that dismissed them as ignorant or expendable, they became the thin line between despair and survival. Take the case of Alais, a linen draper's daughter from Provence. When the plague reached her town in 1348, the local barber surgeon barricaded himself inside his shop with a stash of imported spices believed to purify the air. Alais, who'd spent years watching her mother treat weaving injuries with boiled nettle dressings, took the opposite approach. She turned the family's dying vats into sterilization cauldrons, soaking bandages in a solution of sour wine and crushed garlic. What seemed like peasant superstition was actually cutting-edge antisepsis garlic's allicin compounds, attacking bacteria centuries before germ theory existed. Her real innovation, though, was organization. She trained other women to rotate shifts at sickness, ensuring caregivers got rest and reducing burnout long before modern medicine recognized the concept. The prejudice these healers faced was staggering. Church records from Norwich describe a witch who saved 20 souls with a potion of ground willow bark and honey, only to be burned when the priest decided her success proved demonic aid. Yet their methods quietly reshaped Europe's medical landscape. A handwritten note in the margin of a Parisian plague manual admits that the herb wives' vinegar washes preserve lives better than our bleeding. Even the iconic plague doctor's robe, often credited to Renaissance physicians, was actually adapted from the waxed aprons Marseille fishwives wore to avoid contaminating healthy households. What makes their legacy so revolutionary isn't just their courage, it's how they democratized healing. While male doctors guarded Latin texts like treasure, these women shared knowledge in the vernacular, turning market squares into classrooms. A surviving fragment from a Yorkshire dairy lists plague remedies in a looping, unpracticed hand, evidence of a milkmaid teaching others between chores. Their greatest triumph came not in grand hospitals, but in the quiet moments when a mother recognized early symptoms because a wife had described them over shared laundry tubs, or when a farmer isolated his family in time because the blacksmith's widow had nailed quarantine instructions to the church door. We'll never know most of their names, but every modern protocol for epidemic response, from hand washing to contact tracing, carries echoes of their pragmatic wisdom. They proved that heroism wears no single face, and that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin not with a king's decree, but with a woman's stubborn refusal to let her neighbors die alone. The smell of hops still clung to the brewery's rafters, but no ale bubbled in the great copper vats that winter. Instead, the air was thick with the scent of turnips and barley, of desperation transformed into ingenuity. When the Duke's army laid siege to the city of Bruges in 1488, cutting off supply lines and starving out resistance, most saw the towering brewery as just another empty building. But Adrian van Horn saw something else entirely, a kitchen capable of feeding a city. Adrian wasn't a noble or a warrior. He was a practical man who understood fermentation's alchemy. His vats, designed to hold thousands of gallons of beer, became cauldrons for communal stew. The grain stockpiled for brewing became flour for hardtack biscuits. Even the spent mash, usually tossed to livestock, was boiled again with wild greens scavenged from the city's cracks and crevices. What began as a stopgap measure soon became a system. Adrian organized neighborhood children into foraging parties, sending them to collect dandelions, nettles, even the tender inner bark of elm trees. His apprentices, more accustomed to measuring yeast, now kept meticulous records of which households had eaten that day and which needed portions doubled for the sick or nursing mothers. The true stroke of genius, though, lay in Adrian's understanding of scarcity psychology. He knew hunger made people hoard, so he posted guards not to keep people out but to ensure no one took more than their share. The brewery's courtyard became a makeshift dining hall where meals were eaten together, transforming survival into solidarity. When thieves broke in one night, instead of calling for their hands to be severed as the law allowed, Adrian put them to work stirring vats, their punishment becoming their salvation. Word of his operation reached the Duke himself, who scoffed that a brewer's slop would never break a siege. But by spring, when the gates finally reopened, Bruges' death toll was a fraction of neighboring cities. Adrian's ledgers tell the tale not in heroic prose but in pragmatic columns. 12,000 meals served, 32 vats repurposed, 0 riots. His legacy wasn't just in full bellies, it was in proving that crisis demands creativity, not just charity. The same vats that once fermented ale had distilled something far more potent, the realization that survival tastes best when shared. The hillside had been groaning for weeks, a deep, unsettling rumble that sent pebbles skittering down onto the thatched roofs below. Most villagers dismissed it as winter's thaw, but old Bert and the mason heard something different in those sounds. 30 years of shaping stone had taught him to listen to the language of rock, the way certain cracks sang when tapped, how dampness changed the pitch of a cliff face. When he pressed his ear to the shuddering slope above town, what he heard wasn't just loose dirt, it was the mountain preparing to exhale. While others debated whether to pray or flee, Bertrand studied the hillside with a craftsman's eye. He noticed how rainwater channeled through specific fissures, how the roots of certain shrubs bound the soil tighter than others. His solution wasn't some grand engineered wall, but a patchwork of clever interventions. He recruited farmers to weave fallen branches into living fences that trapped sliding earth. He repurposed broken millstones as anchors, embedding them at angles to redirect the force of debris. Most ingenious of all, he dug narrow trenches following the natural veins of the rock, creating deliberate pathways for the landslide to follow, away from homes and into an abandoned quarry. The night the mountain finally let go, the townspeople huddled in the churchyard, expecting to hear the crash of collapsing roofs. Instead, they witnessed Bertrand's handiwork in action. The avalanche of earth and stone roared down, then split like a river around a boulder, diverted by the very obstacles they dismissed as peasant tinkering. Where the main force should have leveled the blacksmith's workshop, it instead poured harmlessly into the empty pit Bert and had prepared its energy spent. What makes this story extraordinary isn't just the barrier itself, it's how Bertrand's deep material knowledge outsmarted brute force. He didn't try to stop the landslide. He negotiated with it, using an intimate understanding of how Earth moves. Modern geologists would later identify his techniques as precursors to today's debris flow channels and terraced slope stabilization. But Bertrand left no textbooks, just a village full of children who grew up calling certain rock formations the mason's fingers, and a tradition of farmers adding stone reinforcement to vulnerable slopes each spring. His legacy whispers a timeless truth. Sometimes the most sophisticated solutions wear the disguise of humble craftsmanship, because real resilience isn't about controlling nature, it's about learning how to dance with its chaos, one well-placed stone at a time. The river ran red that morning, not with the usual dyes from the workshops lining its banks, but with something far more sinister. A vat of scarlet pigment had cracked overnight, spilling its toxic contents into the waterway that fed half the town. By dawn, fish floated belly up in crimson-tinged eddies, and children who'd splashed in the shallows the evening before writhed with fever. Panic spread faster than the poison itself. But in a ramshackle dye house at the bend in the river, Guilhem the dyer was already hauling vinegar barrels from his cellar, his hands shaking not from fear but from furious calculation. What looked like desperation to bystanders was in fact precision born from years of chemical intuition. Guilhem knew his trade's dark side intimately, how certain pigments contained arsenic for vibrancy, how alum fixatives could turn lethal in large doses. He'd spent a lifetime neutralizing accidental spills in his workshop with vinegar's acidity. Now, facing catastrophe, he scaled up his makeshift remedy with breathtaking audacity. Workers watched in disbelief as he poured gallon after gallon into the contaminated stretch, his movements methodical as a baker kneading dough. "The poison likes lie," he shouted over the growing crowd, "but vinegar is its enemy." The real brilliance lay in his timing. Guilhem didn't just dump vinegar haphazardly. He waited for the tides turning, knowing the incoming current would carry his remedy upstream while the outgoing flow dragged toxins harmlessly toward the sea. As the sharp tang of acetic acid mingled with the metallic stench of the dye, something miraculous happened. The water's unnatural opacity began to clear. By nightfall, the town healer confirmed it. Those who drank the treated water suffered only mild stomach aches, while downstream villages that hadn't received Guilhem's intervention reported convulsions and worse. This wasn't just chemical luck. It was applied science centuries ahead of its time. Modern toxicologists would later confirm Guilhem's instinct. The acetic acid indeed formed insoluble compounds with heavy metals, rendering them far less dangerous. But his legacy wasn't in the chemistry alone. In the weeks that followed, he turned disaster into education, sketching simple diagrams showing how to test water purity with iron nails, which would darken in toxic water, and teaching children rhymes about safe distances from dye runoff. The guilds, once secretive about their processes, began posting warning signs near vats, a radical transparency born from hard-won wisdom. Perhaps most remarkably, Guilhem's accident birthed an early form of environmental policy. The town council mandated clay containment walls for all dye vats, a regulation that spread to neighboring cities. His story forces us to reconsider where true innovation lies, not always in universities or palaces, but in the hands of those who work closest with danger. Because sometimes the difference between poison and remedy is just a matter of perspective, and the courage to act on hard-earned knowledge when the stakes couldn't be higher. The first notes cut through the winter silence like a knife through sackcloth bright, defiant, utterly out of place in a village where empty bellies growled louder than the wind. Henry the minstrel had no bread to give his neighbors as the famine of 1372 dragged into its fourth month. But perched on the frozen stump of the old meeting oak, his lute scarred from years of travel, he offered something equally vital, a reason to keep breathing. This was no ordinary performance. Henry had spent nights listening to the whispers of the starving, the widow who dreamed of her husband's apple orchard, the blacksmith's son who missed the weight of his hammer. Now he wove their memories into song, transforming aching nostalgia into rallying cries. A ballad about the first spring strawberry became an anthem of patience. A drinking tune rewritten with lyrics about shared soup pots turned scarcity into solidarity. Even the children, their faces too thin, clapped along to rhythms mimicking the steady chop of axes splitting firewood, a sound they hadn't heard since autumn. The true genius of Henry's art lay in its precision. He didn't sing of distant feasts or impossible plenty. That would have been salt in wounds. Instead, his verses celebrated microscopic victories, the way the cooper's daughter saved her morning crust to feed her baby brother, how the communal oven's last embers still warmed hands at midnight. By naming these quiet acts of endurance, he made them heroic. Soon, villagers began reporting their own small triumphs to him after dusk, eager to hear them immortalized in the next day's refrain. Modern psychology would recognize Henry's methods as radical resilience building. Studies show that communities who maintain cultural rituals during crises recover faster, not just physically but emotionally. The minstrel grasped this instinctively, that starvation attacks the spirit long before it claims the body. His songs became psychological rations, doled out in measured doses to sustain the will to survive. The famine eventually broke, as all things do, but Henry's greatest legacy wasn't the songs themselves. It was how they reshaped the village understanding of survival. Years later, when floods threatened, survivors didn't just stockpile food. They appointed a hope keeper to record daily acts of courage, because they'd learned a truth we still grapple with today. No one dies of hunger alone. They perish when the light inside gutters out first, and sometimes, against all odds, a single lute string plucked at the right moment can keep that flame alive. The manor house stood empty after the last floodwaters receded, its halls echoing with the absence of children who would never return, its kitchens cold without the clatter of servants who'd fled or perished. Lady Isabel de Montfort should have retreated into mourning, as widows of her station were expected to do. Instead, she ordered the gates flung wide and the linen closets emptied. When the first orphan was brought to her doorstep, a mud-streaked boy clutching the body of his drowned sister, she didn't see charity work. She saw the threads of a new tapestry being woven. What began as makeshift pallets in the banquet hall evolved into something revolutionary. Isabel turned her grief into governance, transforming the estate into a meticulously run sanctuary. The stables became schoolrooms where older children taught younger ones the alphabet scratched onto salvaged slate. The chapel's vestments were cut into winter cloaks, their golden embroidery repurposed as identification tags for the newly named, because Isabel insisted every child deserved more than "Hey you" shouted across a courtyard. Even the wine cellar found new purpose as a dry storeroom for medicinal herbs. Their labels were written in simple pictograms, so even the illiterate could help with distributions. The true innovation, though, lay in her approach to kinship. Medieval society measured legacy in bloodlines and heraldry, but Isabel built hers on chosen bonds. She paired orphans not by age or origin, but by complementary needs. A timid girl who feared thunder with a bold one who sang through storms. A boy who couldn't speak with another who talked enough for both. When local lords sneered that she was playing mother to gutter rats, she turned their scorn into a lesson. A tree's strength lies in its roots, she'd say, but a forest's power is in how the branches interlock. Records from the period reveal astonishing details. Isabel's unnatural family, as critics called it, developed its own dialect, a mix of regional accents, and invented words for things too painful to name outright. They celebrated birthdays on the day each child arrived at the manor, not the day they were born, making survival the cornerstone of identity. Most remarkably, when plague returned a decade later, it was her grown orphans, now blacksmiths, scribes, and midwives, who organized the region's most effective relief efforts, replicating Isabel's models in ways that saved hundreds. This wasn't just altruism, it was social alchemy. In an era when women's power dwindled with their husband's last breath, Isabel rewrote the rules. Her will left the estate not to some distant cousin, but to a council of her orphans, stipulating they must always shelter those the world forgets. Today, archaeologists still find traces of her legacy, toys carved with the manor's crest in far-off villages, descendants of her orphans who passed down the story of the widow who measured wealth not in acres, but in how many empty chairs could be filled at supper. Because sometimes the bravest act isn't facing disaster, it's refusing to let it dictate what comes after. These stories from the medieval world aren't just relics of the past, they're blueprints for resilience that still hold startling relevance today. At first glance, our modern disaster response systems seem worlds apart from those dark ages, with satellites predicting storms and drones delivering medical supplies. But peel back the layers of technology, and you'll find the same fundamental human qualities that saved lives centuries ago. Community bonds stronger than any catastrophe, ingenuity born from necessity, and courage that flares brightest when darkness falls. Take the way Brother Aldrich's flood warnings mirror today's early alert systems. His horseback rides through the storm were medieval Europe's version of emergency broadcasts, proving that timely information has always been the first line of defense. Modern meteorologists might use Doppler radar instead of reading river currents, but the principle remains identical. Knowledge is only life-saving when it reaches people in time to act. Similarly, Sister Marguerite's plague protocols, her vinegar hand-washing and quarantine zones anticipated modern epidemiology by 6 centuries. Her methods show that even without microscopes, careful observation and systematic action can curb contagion. The real lesson lies in how these medieval problem solvers leveraged what they had. When miners trapped underground repurposed tools into air vents, they demonstrated the same adaptive thinking that guides today's search and rescue teams. When potters like Guillaume designed water filters from clay and charcoal, they embodied the DIY spirit seen in modern crisis zones where communities build sandbag walls or rig up solar chargers from salvaged parts. This isn't just history, it's proof that innovation isn't about having the fanciest tools, but about seeing possibilities where others see only limitations. Perhaps most crucially, these stories remind us that disasters are ultimately human experiences. No algorithm can replicate what Adrian the brewer understood when he turned his ale vats into soup kitchens, that hunger gnaws at dignity as fiercely as stomachs. No app can substitute for the minstrel Henry's songs that kept hope alive during famine, just as modern psychologists now use music therapy with trauma survivors. The through line is clear: technology changes, but the human needs remain. A child terrified by an earthquake in 1323 needed the same reassurance as one in 2023: safety, comfort, and the sense that someone's in control. This is where medieval wisdom outstrips modern systems. While we've perfected top-down responses, FEMA trailers, UN aid convoys, we often neglect the grassroots ingenuity these historical cases exemplify. After Hurricane Katrina, it wasn't just government boats that rescued people. It was fishermen steering their private vessels through flooded streets, echoing Finn the fisherman's makeshift rafts. During COVID lockdowns, neighbors revived medieval-style mutual aid networks, delivering groceries to the vulnerable just as Jacques the baker sneaked bread to starving families. The takeaway: official disaster plans work best when they leave room for ordinary people's brilliance. What would happen if today's emergency managers took these lessons to heart? Imagine wildfire evacuation routes designed with shepherd's trail knowledge like Thomas used. Picture hospitals training staff in Agnes the midwife's crisis calmness, turning panic into purposeful action. Envision cities adopting Isabel's orphan care model for displaced families after hurricanes. These aren't fantasies, they're opportunities to bridge ancient wisdom with modern science, creating disaster responses that are both cutting edge and deeply human. The most profound legacy of these 28 acts isn't their individual heroism, but their collective message: survival isn't a solo endeavor. From miners sharing air in collapsed tunnels to villagers forming human chains against floods, their triumphs were always communal. In an age where we can tweet for help but often don't know our neighbors' names, that might be the most vital lesson of all. Because when the next disaster strikes, whether it's a cyber attack or a climate-driven storm, the difference between chaos and resilience won't just be in our gadgets. It'll be in our willingness to look back as we move forward, blending the courage of the past with the tools of the present to face whatever comes next. From monks memorizing flood patterns to miners carving air vents with bare hands, these 28 stories reveal a truth that transcends centuries. Disaster doesn't create heroes, it reveals them. What's astonishing isn't just the courage these individuals displayed, but how ordinary they were before circumstance demanded something extraordinary. A blacksmith became a firefighter, a brewer turned his vats into soup kitchens, a shepherd's understanding of snow saved dozens. These weren't knights in shining armor, they were people who looked at chaos and asked, "What can I do with what I have?" That question echoes through time, finding new answers in every crisis. When Hurricane Katrina submerged New Orleans, it was fishermen in makeshift boats who rescued neighbors from rooftops, just as Finn the fisherman lashed together rafts in medieval Dunwich. During the COVID pandemic, nurses fashioned PPE from snorkeling gear and trash bags, mirroring Sister Marguerite's vinegar-soaked aprons. The tools change, but the human spirit remains startlingly consistent. What separates these stories from mere history is their unfinished nature. Every act of bravery here sent ripples far beyond the moment. The plague jars that inspired modern water filters, the earthquake warnings that evolved into seismic sensors, the communal kitchens that shaped disaster relief protocols. These weren't just reactions, they were revolutions in miniature, proving that innovation often begins not in laboratories, but in the white-hot forge of necessity. This leaves us with a challenge as urgent today as it was 700 years ago. Heroism isn't about having extraordinary skills, but about using ordinary ones extraordinarily well. The next time disaster strikes, whether it's a wildfire or a power outage, someone will become the hero their community needs. It might be the barrister who knows how to purify water with coffee filters, the gamer whose puzzle-solving skills organize evacuation routes, or the teacher who calms terrified children with story songs like Henry the Minstrel. So tell us in the comments which of these 28 acts resonated with you. Maybe it's the baker who defied guild laws to feed the hungry, or the librarian who carried knowledge through flames. Whatever inspires you, carry it forward, because history isn't just something we study, it's something we continue, one courageous choice at a time. Hit subscribe to join us as we keep unearthing these hidden threads of bravery, and remember, the next chapter of resilience is yours.